Good morning, everyone. My name is Crystal O'Malley, and this is the Grant Writing Tips Workshop with the City of Berkeley Civic Arts Program. And today we have two guest panelists serving today, Chris and Weston. And I just want to give a short introduction. They each can speak, but they previously served on our grant review panels the last couple years. So they are giving us great insider tips, and they do this professionally. So Chris, if you'd like to go first.
So should I, Crystal, introduce myself or just sort of go right in? Okay.
Yeah.
So my name is Chris Evans. I'm a local artist, dancer, and musician, and direct a project called Reconstruction Study. I'm also part of a house full of Black Women Collective directed by Amara Tabor Smith and Alan Sebastian Chang. And have been working and collaborating in the Bay Area for a number of years. I've been on the Berkeley Civic Arts Grant panel for 3 years now, and have had a great opportunity to read a wide variety of applications and also get different takes on how people respond to the question. So I'm hoping I can share some of the things that have helped me to understand how organizations work, um, and um, and how they respond to the grant applications. Yeah.
And then Weston, would you like to speak as well?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Weston Peruia. I'm an artist, a visual artist, and both with an individual practice and also with a collective called Related Tactics um, that actually has a couple projects right now up in the Bay Area. I also do a lot of grant writing for mostly small culture-specific organizations, and have worked in a variety of different grant uh, related capacities. I served with the Berkeley Civic Arts Commission a number of years ago, and was involved with the grants program at that point, and also worked for the San Francisco Arts Commission. So I hope a lot of my comments may be geared toward organizational grants, because that was the panel that I just served on for the Berkeley Civic Arts Commission. But I also, as an individual artist, am happy to give perspective on writing grants from that angle as well. I know there's a number of individual artists in attendance as well. So hopefully I can balance those different perspectives in my comments today.
Great, thank you so much. And also with us today is Jennifer Lavorne, our Chief Cultural Affairs Officer. Do you like to say a couple?
Yeah. Thank you, Crystal. Thank you, Crystal, for organizing this. Yeah, we've just been trying every year to add new content in as our technical assistance workshops. And so Crystal and I are really excited for today's opportunity to hear from both Chris and Weston. And yeah, and Crystal, I don't know if you want to say a couple of words as well to introduce yourself.
Yeah, so I oversee the grants program. So if you do have any questions, we're going to try to get to everyone's questions and answers today. But if you happen to not get to everyone's, I'm definitely here to help assist. And so is Jennifer. You can just email us at civicarts@cityofberkeley.info. And then we're going to begin right now. We're going to start with a kind of a framework of an overview of what our panelists believe are strong applications. If you guys want to jump into that type of beginning sets before we get into the individual type of questions I'm going to prepare for.
Crystal, should I start? Okay. So one of the things I was thinking about as I was preparing for the panel is, what is the function of the grant application process? And I think it can be both presenting yourself to a grant panel, but it can also be a way to reflect and assess on where you are as an organization or as an artist. And it can be a tool for clarifying um, your project, your strategies, your fundraising strategies, how you are actually going to achieve the thing that you want to achieve. And so I just, for myself, when I'm writing grant applications, I really use it as a tool to help me hone and define my work. So I think use it, one piece of advice would be to use the grant application process not as just another thing that you have to do, but as something that is going to actually help strengthen your organization and your project. I think from the perspective of a reader on the panels, the applications that are strongest for me are the ones that clearly define what the project is and how it will be accomplished, what the impact on the communities will be, and have a cultural equity vision and specific strategies for how the particular project will advance cultural equity. Those are the components of the grant application, but they also just sort of using very clear and direct language is really helpful. And those are my pieces of advice.
Yeah, to build on that, I think I guess first before jumping into some of the tips, I also just want to acknowledge that this is a very challenging time for all of us working in the field, and I recently served on some emergency grant panels, and so I've been seeing a lot of the range of experiences right now and different ways that people are trying to pivot. So I know it's very complicated and very specific to each organization and artist position, type of work you're doing, what's happening. And so I realized that this, even whatever we can offer today is probably only going to touch on a particular part of the range of things that you're having to grapple with. So, I apologize if we can't cover every part of that. But I also do think that funders and panelists are trying our best to take in and be as generous as possible and understand that everyone's just trying to figure things out on the fly. So I think to that end, um, part of the clarity thing that Chris is talking about, I think is also about being as straightforward as possible. We're at a moment where I don't think anyone expects everyone to be like operating at full speed and with like balanced budgets but um, being as clear as possible what's happening, where you're hoping to go, the strategies that you're sort of sorting out to move forward is probably the best path forward, and allowing everyone to sort of understand your thought process. And this goes for even, hopefully when we can all make it through this moment of crisis, that helping analysts understand your strategies and thought process is always the best course of action. And so whenever possible, trying to be as specific as possible, but also understand, especially for a grant like this, for the organizational grants where you're doing this operational grant that's for the most part a recurring grant, that you don't necessarily have to feel like you have to throw the kitchen sink in and like talk about every aspect of your history, your strategic plans, your grand vision for the world, but that the more you can hone in on a handful of very specific things that you can drill down on, the more helpful it'll be for reviewers, so that they're not trying to dig through and find tiny bits of information that they're trying to stitch together throughout the application, but that you're helping guide everyone through that process. And then I guess generally that for especially for all the categories in the BCAC grants, that you're dealing with multidisciplinary panels. And so that's important to keep in mind as you're writing to us, that within the group of panelists, we all have a range of expertise and can share with one another and are in conversation with one another. But if you're diving too deep into discipline specific jargon, or the weeds of particular context that we're not necessarily familiar with, that it's not necessarily helpful in conveying what you're doing, and that you want to speak to a well-informed art audience, but that may not know the nuances of your particular part of the field. Thank you.
Great, that's an amazing overview. And so right now we're going to jump into some of the specific questions, hopefully that I picked the ones that I would see across in any other type of grant category. So let's talk a little bit more about mission statements, organizations maybe, or artist narratives, and then artistic progressions. What would be some advice about writing a strong, let's say, statements for that category? Any one of you can go on that.
I can jump in first. Um, Sort of similar to what I was saying just a second ago, that I think while it's, for the most part, I would say that this section tends to be pretty straightforward, but um, I think this is a challenging one sometimes for organizations who do have a really long track record and have been around for a while and have, especially if the organization has gone through a number of different phases and iterations over time, and that you don't necessarily have to. Well, it's helpful to maybe have some highlights of that evolution and artists you've worked with in the past and landmark work in your history. You don't necessarily have to um, throw everything in, and it's helpful to prioritize the most recent work and to highlight to give a good sense of like how those things, when those things took place, and the most recent work as the bulk of the description, because really it's about giving a compelling sense of where you are at this moment. Um, and I think this is also a section where it's helpful to be really clear for any kind of organization that has a slightly more complicated structure or is doing cross-sector work, or maybe it's like an arts program within a larger nonprofit, that you make really clear what the structure and relationships of different entities are, um, who's doing what work, the roles, the like staffing roles, budget roles, that um, that you're also clear about who's actually producing the work too. Like if you're more of an art service organization that's providing supports to other people who are presenting the work, that you make that clear and you don't sort of conflate the work of other organizations working with you and your work, um, and that uh, yeah, just in general, that you um, that you just clarify the operation so that we understand the overall sense of who you are and what your particular role in the ecosystem is.
And I think just adding on to that and building onto the idea that we are, the panelists are often from a range of different disciplines, and they may not be your particular discipline, that enough description for us to understand the evolution of your work, how it connects to your mission, and I think how you might be, so if there are specific awards for your particular discipline, you don't have to list every single award you've received, but it gives us a sense of where you are within the community of your discipline, and that can be helpful for people if if it's a theater award and we're not theater specific people. So I think that kind of highlighting is helpful. I think for organizations that have been around for a while, we kind of start with the mission and sort of look at how the work connects to the mission. And it may be that that mission has evolved in certain ways. So having enough of the history of the group and the points of evolution to show what this proposed work is building on is really helpful. For example, you might start as a small community visual arts organization and end up wanting to do different kinds of visual art programming, and it's helpful to know sort of what that trajectory is. But I think keeping in mind that if there's too much information, then that can actually make it harder to get a clear picture than it would be to kind of pare it down. Yeah, and I think just this is sort of being sure that the work samples that you provide kind of demonstrate or support this section is also really helpful. And I think, I don't know if we'll have a more of a discussion of work samples later, but just a few things for me is if they can be current and sort of either, well, both show what the work of the organization is and point toward what the work is going to be, that is really helpful. Getting a sense if it's dance, getting a sense of what the movement is, if it's visual art, getting a sense of what the images are, and the experience of an exhibition, for example, is really helpful. And for me, personally, the work samples don't have to be highly produced. They just have to be clear enough for me to hear if I need to hear language, to see movement if I need to see movement, and to see visual images if I need to see visual images.
Great. And then,
oh,
go, Weston.
wanted to make a quick, I know since there's individual artists as well, and this isn't even necessary to this grant, but oftentimes in describing an artist's work and making a statement, what you're trying to do is set up this sense of your own, similar to organizations, that you're trying to set a sense of your trajectory and where you've been, what you're working on, and what you may be proposing fits into that arc of your work. And so whatever you can do to kind of build this, you're basically creating this compelling narrative about where you're going and why people should be investing in this opportunity for you. And so whatever you can do to kind of give this sense that there's this momentum and you just need this infusion of grant support to push you over that hump to that next step in your work. And so it's really about, potentially social context, personal, professional opportunities coming up, conceptual artistic directions that you're going in, but you're basically using this as sort of the groundwork so that when you talk about the project itself, it almost feels like it's this inevitable thing that, oh, of course you're going in this direction, and there's this drive that you've set up in describing your past work that carries you into the next section.
Thank you. And then next, we're going to go into some maybe advice about how to write out goals for if it's our festivals, our individual artists, or art organizations. So it's project goals. As a reader, what are things that you like to give some high scores on the application?
I think for me, really having a clearly defined goal is really important. And this can be in bullet point. This doesn't have to have a lot of language around it. In fact, the more succinct you can be in defining the goal, the clearer it is to understand. So I think that's the first important step. And then describing how you're going to accomplish the goal, who's going to be part of accomplishing the goal, what are timelines for the goal, like just as much specificity about how you're going to accomplish the goal and how the grant is going to support that is helpful. And it doesn't have to be a lot of language. I think just giving us a picture of how that will happen is really helpful. I also like to see not just the programmatic and goals, but also goals around capacity building, cultural equity, increasing community impact kind of listed in that section as well, with strategies and timelines and all of that defined. That for me gives me a picture of kind of what the organization is doing and how the organization will accomplish it.
Yeah, I echo what Chris said. I think, especially in this moment when I think one of the big questions going into any panel is going to be, what's the state of your organization? If there's not at least one goal that is somehow talking about operations or strategies, you're leaving panelists with a lot of questions that you don't necessarily want to have just sitting in the room as this sort of elephant in the room. And I think, and yeah, I think with this past panel, whenever there were goals that were purely like giving your programming season for the next year, that was often very frustrating because you just didn't get a sense of what else was happening in the organization. Um, and occasionally there were some applications, particularly for larger groups who had gone through a lot of strategic planning or other kinds of similar processes recently. Um, there was a sense that you were trying to save time, so there was just sort of plugging that whole what you generated from that into this section without a lot of filtering and paring down, like Chris was saying. And so I think while I appreciate that you're trying to save yourself time, it also doesn't leave any room to drill down and give the kind of information and detail that Chris was talking about. So just pulling out 3 of those goals from your strategic plan and diving into those is far more effective than trying to give us an info dump of everything that's happening in your organization.
And I think stating the goal as a goal. I think there were some applications last year that sort of stated a program area, but didn't say specifically kind of what the goal around that program area was. And I think this is really helpful. It's a reflection of how the organization is responding to the moment and responding to what the group, how the group wants to evolve and grow. And I think transparency around that is always really refreshing and helpful as a panelist. And I think especially in this moment where we may set goals and may not be able to specifically achieve them, but I think understanding them, defining them in response to what the organization wants to do in the moment, and what are your strategies, what are your contingencies, and things like that are not only helpful for us, but also a worthwhile exercise for the organization.
Great. So we have the mission statement, the goals. Then next we get into the capacity to achieve this. And this is also including staffing and board members. How do we like to see that listed in applications? If you could give a little detail on that.
So generally, I think of this as a section that's really like a complementary piece to the rest of your application. So like Chris was saying earlier with the goals, this is where you really dive into more information about, okay, you set up these goals, who's carrying it out, what are the qualifications, what are the skill sets that you have on your team that are going to give us a confidence that you can carry out that work. So along those lines, if you're talking about bringing in new board members or staff, is it clear how you're going to identify those people and support them as they come into the organization and will carry out that work? And this is also where budget comes into play, and I think we're talking about that more in detail a little later, but those are sort of the complementary pieces in here. And no, I know this is sometimes a very challenging section to deal with, particularly given the range of sizes that you may be at in terms of operations and your organizational history. And I do think that panelists try to be as generous and understanding as possible in terms of, like we're not going to have the same expectations for a new, smaller organization that has like 1 FTE next to a $2 million budget organization with a whole venue that they're operating. And so there we were sort of positioning ourselves to understand where things are, but we just need to understand what the structures are and how you're setting yourself up for success. And I guess in terms of individual artists, I think this is also, capacity is always sort of a question for panelists as well, that what you're really trying to do throughout your narrative is to give panelists a confidence that you can execute what you're proposing, and that you have the artistic skill set, the community-minded skill set, whatever it might be, to carry out your project, and that it's partially about your artistic history and what you're talking about in terms of your resume, as well as work samples. And if because you're likely proposing new work, that you want to sort of piece together and triangulate enough of a sense of your work samples that the panelists can sort of look at that and say, okay, we don't know what this new thing is because it's going to be this new leap in this artist's trajectory, but we have confidence that they have done work at this scale before, or tried to push, and there's this sort of sense that they're growing in that way, or that the complexity of their the relationships that they're building has built up over time. So it's yeah, it's something that's relevant to artists as well as organizations.
Yeah, and just building on that, I think that this section helps us understand the how of what you're going to do, and it is important for us to have an idea of how, and that you will be able to accomplish this organizationally or as an individual artist. Um, I think some of the things that I look for in this section are, what is the administrative, this is particularly with organizations, what is the administrative structure of the organization? Who is holding the responsibilities of scheduling, fundraising, managing staff if need be? And is that clearly defined, who and how that is done? I think last panel, there were several organizations with alternative structures, which I find really interesting. There doesn't have to always be kind of the traditional structure of an ED and staff and artists. But I think we have to understand why you have that particular structure, and then how the administration of the work gets accomplished. So I think spending a little time explaining that is helpful and important. I think in terms of board, that understanding the role of the board is helpful. Is the board an active sort of participant in the running of the project? Who are the board members? How long have they served? What kinds of expertise are they bringing to the organization? That sort of gives an indication of the capacity. And I think in situations where board members are also members of the organization, it's helpful to understand sort of why that's the case, and if there's any thinking about bringing in outside people for any particular reason. So just sort of giving us a good picture of the board is helpful for understanding the capacity. I think having a clear financial picture, and I know in this time it's really hard to maybe be able to state specifically where funding is going to come from and how things are going to work. And so I think just as much transparency, as much thinking that you can provide about where you are as an organization or as an individual is helpful in that. And like Weston said, we are looking generously at that, that with the understanding that everybody is really struggling in a very unpredictable time. So I think, let me see if there's anything else. Yeah, I think it's, I think that piece of capacity, just sort of knowing that you're not asking your staff to do more than what they can do. You're not asking the staff to do things beyond what is the scope of their particular expertise. I think just having a good, for us, a clear picture of, oh yeah, that's going to be doable and sustainable is part of how I kind of understand the capacity of an organization.
Okay, next we're going to get into cultural equity. This has been a difficult question in the past, but I know more and more grant applications are asking this question. And we have seen in the past the statement open to everyone. And I wanted you guys to speak more to that when you read that on an application, when it says let's say it's a festival saying it's open to everyone, open to the public. or individual artists, if we can speak more to like all our categories on this question, not just organizations, but if you're an individual artist doing a performance or presenting some type of work, or festivals doing a certain event out in the public, how would you like the culturally equity question statement? What is something that's very strong to you?
I'll just start, and I imagine we'll have a fair amount of back and forth with this one. Um, most of my sort of reading of applications has been organizational, so I'm extrapolating from organizations to think about festivals and individual artists. But I think that there are some things that are shared. And one is, I think, just starting with, how do you understand what cultural equity is? For me, diversity is not the same thing as cultural equity. And I think people have varying definitions of what cultural equity is. I tend to think of it as the whole ecology, the whole cultural ecology of a community, and what are the voices that are heard, what are the voices that are supported, how does that happen in relation to sort of narratives of what is valued art and what is not valued as high art. And so I think there is a fair amount of thinking that I think we all should be doing about what is cultural equity, and then what is my role in it. And so for me, to say something is open to everyone, that can be a start, but it doesn't sort of ask the next question of, well, is it open? Are people aware of it? Is it a welcoming environment to different communities? Am I choosing artists who are going to draw people from different communities? Am I sort of opening my understanding up of what the content of this particular festival or presentation should be? And so I think those are questions that it's really good for individuals, festival organizers, and organizations to sit with.
Yeah, I think building off of that, I think of cultural equity as being about power and decision making. And so in that sense, representation is helpful, but it's one step in a much longer process. And that there, what Chris was saying about um, those, if you're talking about being open to all, like what are those barriers to access historically, and how are you proactively creating these durational relationships that help push past that and create trust and bring folks into a process. And so and along those lines, I think it's also about how does this kind of thing infuse all levels of the work. So it's not if you're talking about programming and a few specific projects within a larger series, the question that always comes up for me is, okay, it's great that in these particular pieces that you're highlighting, a broader range of artists, working with artists of color, whatever it may be, and that. But then I wonder what's happening with the rest of the season. How does this impact the broader curatorial view? Which doesn't necessarily mean that you have to completely upend your programming and shift your focus, but it does. I think it does help for panelists to understand, what's the strategy here? Is it just like popping in a couple of programs here and there, or is it part of this broader sense of community building, of transforming the ways that you look critically at some of the other pieces, create community dialogues around that wrap around the presentation of certain work. So yeah, I think it's a much larger, where in some ways it asks and challenges folks to step back a little bit and understand the broader strategy across all of the work being done.
Yeah, and just building on what Weston is saying, for me, the organizations that have developed a theory of change and strategies around how to accomplish that theory of change at the level of the organization, at the level of the content and programming, and at the level of larger policies, for example, that affect the particular discipline or community around the work of that group. Um, it's that for me just sort of then it's sort of infused throughout the organization, and it's really clear kind of how that organization is moving toward cultural equity, and I find that really helpful.
We have spoken before about it's not just necessarily what the groups they're targeting, but also as the organization or the individual artist, like what is their personal relationship with what they're trying to achieve in the cultural equity, and then also speaking to more like specific data, like actual numbers. Do you guys prefer that, or do you guys like more of the storyline, or can we give it a little bit more detail about the actual relationship to maybe if it's a specific demographic or marginalized community um, within the like within the maybe it could be just an individual artist doing a performance, like how do they speak to that?
Yeah, I guess diving into maybe some of those nitty gritty things. I know that I remember seeing a lot of plans that included um, an- equity strategies that centered around anti-bias training, which I think is a great step, but I think is not in and of itself alone a broader equity strategy. Um, a lot of the plans also centered around affordability, um, which is great. But I think sometimes it was hard to get a sense of what that meant within in the nitty gritties of that. So it's, a lot of it often was around scholarships or discounted tickets. But if you're aggregating those numbers and don't break down what the actual discounts or scholarship awards are, how many students you're impacting, how those things are line up against your regular tuition, etc. I think it just sometimes was hard to position and get a sense of how many people are being impacted and served by this, and how many folks are getting access to that. And then I think in terms of demographic data, there were a few different ways and sort of bumps that I feel like I often see, like oftentimes folks will describe their demographics as being reflective of the Bay as a whole and just kind of use that as a stand-in. And I personally never know what that means. And so that's not really a good shortcut to use, because it needs more detailed and specific than that. Um, and I also noticed that there's folks who sometimes specifically aggregate um, people of color, women, LGBT folks, people with disabilities all into one percentage, which, is, I think folks think is straightforward, but then what you're sort of implicitly saying in that is that then the remaining percentage of your audience or artists or whoever you're talking about are straight, white, able-bodied men. And depending on the percentages you're talking about, it may not be as impactful a data point as you may think it is. So I would recommend not smashing together marginalized communities in one percentage. Um, and then it also, along those lines, it becomes very clear when you're omitting data that's maybe not as favorable to you. And so if you're like talking in real nuanced detail about your staff and your board, and then audience starts getting a little wiggly, I think it kind of the sense that maybe you're not as comfortable talking about who you're actually reaching in your audience, or if you have a lot of detail on every aspect of your demographic, but then aren't talking about race, I think that also stands out. And so, I think being transparent and um, maybe it's something that is a goal to address. Maybe it's not, but just to be as straightforward as possible and give the fullness of what you're seeing in your staff, board, audiences is much more helpful than trying to position yourself in a way that isn't as authentic to what your work actually is.
Yeah, and this is tricky. This is a tricky, data is a tricky thing, I feel like, in this category, because we can get down to just sort of a simple category of race or gender or able-bodiedness, and sort of not what does that mean in a broader strategy? So I think that the statistics around the different communities that you're reaching are a starting point, but it's also kind of, why are you reaching these communities? There are many different kinds of Black communities or Latinx communities in the Bay Area. Who are you in relationship with is really, and why is, for me, a little bit more interesting. I think that data can be helpful, but it's a starting place for sort of addressing cultural equity in a deeper way. And there was something else that Weston said that I agreed with and wanted to build on, and it's escaping me. I'll see if it comes back to me. But oh, sorry. Now I remember. I I think the the acknowledging where you are, for me, is really great. Like, we are not where we want to be with cultural equity. We're here and we want to get here. This is where we're starting from. For me, being able to watch over several years the progress of different organizations toward their cultural equity goals is really exciting. And I feel like it demonstrates a commitment to it in a way that, if you just start with the rosy picture, we don't know kind of where you are or where you're going. And that's really is exciting and helpful for us as panelists.
And something Chris said also sparked about, in terms of how this impacts individual artists, that idea of like who you're in relationship with. I think where I've seen individual artists in particular really successfully make a case of, and usually this question of equity is wrapped up in audience and outreach and all of those things for individual artists. And I think oftentimes successful individual artist proposals talk about this by talk about some of the perhaps collaborations, partnerships, way sort of culturally specific or community specific avenues and outlets and mechanisms that they're using to reach and connect with the people that they're sharing the work with, and that the having a sense of how relationships inform that, how nuance and an understanding of community informs that, I think is usually how successful, really thoughtful, equitable strategies manifest in how people talk about it, because it demonstrates, like this was saying, this relationship and this authentic dialogue with a body of people.
Okay, next let's get into maybe just budget and work samples, specifically notes. What if an organization or individual art, or actually our individual artists submit budget, but if a festival has a deficit, what are your thoughts on that when you want to see the notes?
Go ahead. Sorry,
Um,
no, sorry. Go ahead, Chris. Sorry.
I was just going to say that, looking at the budget gives us is another picture of the organization, and it's an opportunity to both explain successes and challenges. So when I'm looking at a budget, I look for where there's a big change. If there's a big increase in income, or there's a big decrease in income, or the deficit, there's a deficit overall, but especially looking at expenses as well. Is there a big increase in expenses? And for me, the groups that explain each of those big variations, it helps to give a picture of where the group is financially. And these are hard times, so it may not be that the financial picture is looking super rosy right now, but giving us the explanation and sort of showing in the different sections what your strategies are for kind of addressing the deficit are really helpful for us as panelists.
And like we've been saying over the course of this, I think that we understand that there may be moments of financial challenge, particularly now, but having at least a statement that talks about this is the picture, these are the strategies, these are the things that the board is doing, these are the things that we're implementing to pivot, being as clear about that and being um, as strategic as possible in talking about those things, I think is always helpful so that we have a sense that there may be challenges, but you know what you're doing. And so I think, throughout this, I think grants are often this, or proposals are often this thing of like, do we do we trust that you have a handle on what's happening? And so budgets are the same. Budget notes are a way that you can convey that. I will say like one sort of technical thing that seemed to come up in a lot of budgets across a range of budget sizes was accumulated surplus or deficit. That final line in the budget. Oftentimes there were wonky math things where people weren't carrying over accumulated service surplus or deficit from the previous year, and between the 2 years that we're looking at, it wasn't being calculated across. And so it was almost like maybe things were just being calculated in silo. And so it was hard to get a sense of what the actual surplus or deficit might be. And so just making sure that you're keeping an eye on that and using that as another tool in giving a sense of where your organization is at, or so that we don't have questions about like, oh, it, do they actually understand what the picture is? Are they hiding something? Are they overlooking something? So just make sure you're checking that math and using that line in particular properly.
Yeah, and I would add also for that for groups that are programs within a larger organization where there may be a shared budget, um, pulling out the specific budget of the program or project that you're doing is really helpful. And then if there's cross support, then seeing what that support is. But we can't really get a clear picture of the finances of a project if it's mixed with a larger organization. So that's another important piece.
Yeah, that's definitely an area where budget notes are incredibly helpful. Because yeah, we had the extreme of either mingling everything so that we couldn't pull it out, or extracting everything but with no context of what the larger organization was. So then if you're showing a budget in your arts program because it's drawing a lot of support from the large organization, but you don't note that, then we don't the budget becomes almost impossible to assess.
Okay, great. And then what about the work samples for individual artists, even festivals? Um, what is being uploaded? What if you like to see current things or their best work, especially what type of media they show? If you could speak a little bit about that.
Um, yeah, and I mentioned this earlier when we were talking about the artistic description section, that it's helpful to have um, samples that show the organization's work or the artist's work, um, and and as current as possible is helpful, and also samples that show how whatever the proposed work might build on that work is really helpful. Um, I again, I think I said this before. Something that is super produced is not that's not the most important thing to me. Really being able to get a sense of if you're proposing a performance project, a dance performance project, what is the movement? What is the what is the choreography? What is the how is the work going to the past work going to support the future work? One of the things and similarly, if it's a visual arts sort of project, understanding, really seeing what the visual art is, really as much as possible getting a sense of what an exhibition feels like for an audience or for a visitor to the center.
Yeah, I think as Chris has been saying, I think you know work that conveys or samples that convey the work are always the highest priority. Sometimes I think, especially for organizations, there's a temptation to show like brochure type images of kind of ambiguous crowds of people or facilities or testimonial footage and all of that. I think might be okay in like a supplementary thing as a lower priority, but I think foregrounding the work itself is always the highest priority. And um, for for all applicants, I think, especially for individual artists, showing work that supports the proposal. So the priority is always like I would say work in the last 2 years. But if you maybe are proposing something that's more in alignment with an older project, I usually recommend having kind of a split. So like having at least a handful of things from the last 2 years, but then a couple of samples from the work or projects in the past that better aligned with what's being proposed, but always using your work sample notes to contextualize that to give people a sense of what they're looking at, why this mixture, um, that you're always setting expectation properly. So giving a sense of like, what are we looking at? Why are we looking at this? Are there other collaborators involved in this so that we understand who is responsible for what we're seeing? And then um, also along the lines of what Chris was saying, if you're doing performance-based work, you don't want to do clip reels or things that are so edited that we don't have a sense of the arc of um, what you do and how it's being presented. And similarly for visual artists, sometimes I think there's this sense that we need to maximize everything. So we're like someone might throw like a few different artworks in one slide, and you never want to do that because then it starts getting confusing about whether we're looking at one piece or it's a mixture of pieces. And so, keep it straightforward, clear what we're looking at, and use the notes to support that. Um, and then, as I was saying earlier too, that this work samples are one of the key ways that for individual artists, that you're conveying your capacity and the level of craft that you might be executing at, the ways that you think through your project goals, and oh, and then that I guess I had said earlier about trying not to use things like testimonials or just crowds of people, but if your work is about community engagement as integral to your practice, um, that that may be relevant footage, but trying to be as selective as possible so that you're not just throwing in chaotic crowds, but that you select and hone in on the piece that best supports this sense of like the engagement, like the artistic part of how you do that, engage with that kind of social practice in your work.
Great, we covered all our topics. I just want to make sure if there was any other last minute tips before we get into the questions, maybe any recommendations on how many readers should read your application, or anything, statements about like an application should look like a promotional thing, but mainly it's really a grant application. Do you have any recommendations for that?
Thanks, Crystal, for reminding me. I meant to say this. Yeah, I think as part of using the grant application as a process for assessing and reflecting on the organization and your work, having giving yourself time to write the application, so you're not doing it a couple days before, but have time to write some different versions of it and get outside readers or editors to read through different versions and give feedback is really helpful. It's nice to have an application without grammatical errors. For me, that's not the most important thing. It's really how the content is being portrayed and the picture that's being drawn. And I think it's hard sometimes with our own work to present that picture because we have so much of the context with us or inside of us. And so getting someone who might not be in the field or might not be directly connected to read through and give response is really helpful. And I think draw on your resources. If you have board members that are writers, have them review and give feedback.
Okay, what Weston, did you have any input or okay, we can start getting into the questions. If anyone wants to submit their questions, we can start at the very top. There was one, what was the best way to present a budget to the committee, the format? So in our application this year, our format is we have a buildable budget form. So you would just enter your data into our application. I believe this was answered or asked before we went into the budget topic about specifically writing out your notes. But was there anything else you guys like to mention? Here's another question. Applications requesting upload program calendars last year, current year, and projected year, showing the numbers and variety of events, productions, presentations, and exhibitions. Can panelists give suggestions on how a proposal should talk about the projected year in light of not knowing if programs can be in person or restrictions right now in place for the person events? Can they discuss how they evaluate in-person versus virtual programming and how they would be evaluating the quality and reach of virtual programming?
That's a really great question, and it's a really hard question to respond to because I feel like we're having to do um, so much contingency planning as artists. Are we going to be able to have live events um, or not? Do we have to do everything on Zoom? And I think one of the things that I would be probably thinking about looking at whether an event is Zoom or in person um, are is is there sort of consideration of the Zoom platform, and that this is not just a replication of what a live event would be, that there's use of the digital platform um, or consideration of the digital platform in the creation of the programming, so that it's not just a sort of we take the live event and just put it on Zoom. And I think I think there's opportunities in that, and I think it's also just important for us all to be thinking about how we use this platform in effective ways to do our programming. So I'll start there, Weston. I'm sure you have some things to add.
No, that is a really great question, and I think my initial response is that, generally speaking, I think my tendency would be to be very um, generous about like that. I don't think any of us really have a full sense of like what um, the maximum quality online programming is, unless that's something that's been inherent to your work, long before this. Um, but I think for me, the things that I tend to look at around that are what's the depth and overall strategy in it. Is this something that's in dialogue with your audience, community, artists, whoever you're serving? Um, is it is there kind of a range um, of programmatic approaches within that maybe address some of the issues around access or different modes of what people may need to to engage with the work, given that I think all of us are reaching this saturation point with being online all the time. Um, that's and then I think making sure that you're updating your audience and your reach and how you talk about those things in relation to this. That's you know if you're just been plugging in the old information and not giving a sense of who your targets are, or if you've already rolled out some of these programs, who you're seeing coming into the work, it can sometimes be this really hard switch over and hard to get a sense of how you're even assessing that impact. Because I know a lot of folks have talked about how they're actually reaching a much broader audience internationally, perhaps with this. And so what does that look like? How is that shifting your thinking? Um, so and also acknowledging that there's also a lot of organizations who I know are prioritizing reassessing and planning for in person rather than switching just to virtual and trying to find a hybrid or going into a different kind of mode of planning and working at this state. So I think each organization is gonna have a different strategy, and giving us a sense of what that is and your thought process behind that, I think is the priority over trying to just like throw in programs just because you need to make that shift or meet a calendaring mandate.
Thank you for answering that one or giving more clarification. Next, we have another question down the line. What if a project doesn't lend itself to PC criteria or language or slash language?
I'm going to translate that question to say, what if the project or organization doesn't align with the cultural equity criteria that's in our grants? So either for an organization or an individual artist project.
I think, ultimately, to me, it's about trying to bring people to your work, right? You know, how are you trying to have as wide a depth of impact and reach to what you're doing, and creating a sense of access to your work from people who maybe haven't had a chance to experience it, or maybe interested but have had these barriers to feeling like it's something for them. And so ultimately I think, and then I guess stepping back from that, cultural equity is one of the criteria that we're scoring against. So if it's also something that you are railing against, then maybe this isn't the right fit, or that's something that you can't address. So, and I don't say that as I'm not a representative of BCAC, but I think as a panelist, if I see someone who's sort of butting their heads up against that, then I have questions about whether this is the right funding source.
Yeah, and I think just sort of practically, if I'm reading an application and one of the criteria is cultural equity, if the project doesn't have a cultural equity vision, then the marks for that are low, which doesn't mean the project shouldn't happen, but as Weston say, it may not be the best fit for this particular organization or project.
Okay, thank you. Then another question is, should the work have a Berkeley connection? So if you're reading grants specifically written out for the civic arts grants for Berkeley.
I mean, there is I think some of that is an eligibility question, right? So I would encourage looking through the baseline eligibility criteria around the percentage of your programming that has to be serving the city, and keeping in mind that this is a civic arts grant, which is different than maybe like a private foundation grant. So it is, because it's drawing on tax resources from the city, you know, just in terms of the rationale and impetus for the city to fund projects. They want something that's going to impact its citizenry and its community base. So that's always key to how you're positioning any proposal to a city entity.
Yeah, and I think we didn't talk a lot specifically about community impact, but that is one of the categories of the grant application that applicants are asked to respond to. And I think just given that there is a cultural equity category, a community impact category, and then as Weston said it's a city grant that's funded by city tax funds that for me, understanding what the impact on the Berkeley community is an important part of how I assess the application.
Okay. And then next we have, I think this is one of the umbrella organizations. Should we submit an org budget if looking for to support a program with this grant and not the larger organization? And there's only in-kind support from the larger organization to the program other than receiving the grant. So I think this is asking if it's a large, a program within a larger organization, how would you like to see that in the budget? Do you like to see like the bigger organization and then specifically also the arts programming, or do you only want to see the arts programming within the budget?
Oh, it's hard to. Oh, but I guess it's hard to say without knowing the real specifics. So that might be something to follow up with staff around. But I would say that for the most part, at least personally, I'd like to see the arts program budget with maybe notes that help give a sense of the larger organization and that structure and those numbers so that we understand the context for that. I do have some questions about what it means if it's just in-kind support from the organization to the arts program, because then I don't have a real sense of what that means in terms of what your actual budget size and capacity is and how the level of programming that you're putting out. So in some ways that's sort of a question of how it then weighs up against your expenses as well. So yeah, it sounds like it might need a little bit of a deeper dive.
Yeah, and I think when I'm looking at the budget, I'm trying to understand how the specific project is going to be supported financially. So for me, the budget around the arts programming would be kind of an important piece at least, and then with notes about what is the in-kind support would sort of for me be a way of assessing, okay, these are additional resources that the programming has.
Oh, I will say, I guess the caveat to what I was saying, I think still that the structure-wise that we want to see the arts budget as the priority, but that if you're talking about a festival where it really is like a much more spare programming sort of budget, that I think that's maybe a different thing, different scenario than what I was saying in terms of like the questions about the operation and how much activity there is. So that yeah, take that with that caveat.
Great. I think that Crystal's computer died, so she had made me co-host because she was seeing that her battery was running out. So, so I see a question that says, would our mission statement be similar to an RFQ? Do you want to take a stab at that? I don't quite understand the question, but if you want to take a stab at it, we can try.
You said RFQ, Jen? Is it?
Yeah, request for qualifications. I don't know, maybe the person that wrote this can add another question and we can get back to it if there's no immediate answer popping up.
I don't quite understand the relationship between the two, honestly.
Yeah. Okay, here's another one. How could the collective who is applying feel more comfortable that the people who are reviewing their application from the panel is from a valid perspective in what potential the art or project could do for the inner community? Are there a lot of volunteers whose opinions can negatively impact an applicant's proposal? So I guess they're asking like how, this might even be more a question for me than for the panelists themselves, but like how do they have confidence in the process, knowing that there are panelists who might bring their subjectivity to the process? I mean, I'll just take a stab at that and then maybe you all can add on. So in terms of our overall process, we put out a call asking for panelists. So that is on our website right now. And if you, are interested in being a panelist or know someone who you think would be a great panelist, please submit an application for that. And then the panels that are selected, that's actually selected and approved by our Civic Arts Commission. So those are folks who have been appointed by our elected officials to have oversight over our art programming. And so, they're the oversight body. They're the ones that approve the people who are serving to do this evaluation. We have criteria on our application around what we're looking for in terms of people who are steeped in artistic disciplines, they're arts professionals, they value cultural equity because that is a value that our city has for our arts programming. So, so I would say that's the whole system that is behind how panelists end up serving. And then there are 3 panelists for each panel. So that also weighs out sort of, if there's one inconsistent vote, it's going to be weighed out by 2 others. So there will be kind of a consensus vote that emerges through that. So do either of you have any additional comments on that?
I would also just add that that I've assessed an application from a certain perspective, and then through conversation have learned and shifted my thinking about the application because of the process of really talking through and getting different perspectives. And I think every panel that I've been on, there's been this real commitment to trying to really understand what the organization is doing and check our biases and subjectivities through the process of conversation I think that it's a process, and I think it's a combination of, from our end, we are really committed to understanding as well as we can what an application is presenting to us, and seeing if that fits the criteria, how that fits with the criteria of the grant. And then I think the other piece is just what the application is presenting to us. So just making, so we're kind of in dialogue and relationship with that application in the process of kind of making these assessments.
Yeah, I would just echo that and empathize with the challenge and vulnerability that it takes to put forward a proposal to be assessed by people you don't know and who might be outside of your immediate community. And but at the same time, I think that you're entering into a public process and a civic process, and so that's really the work. Like your job as an applicant and as an artist who's asking for public funding is to be able to sort of open up your work and engage with folks who may not be in that in-group. And so that's the challenge, but it's also kind of the requirement of getting public funding. And so yeah, it takes work and practice to frame and think about and engage with a broader audience that you're asking to support your work.
And I just want to put in a plug also for our open review process. So for those of you who are new to applying to our grants or even new to applying to grants at all, we have an open panel review process. So we will be posting the schedule for those and you can just tune in. We're going to be having them on Zoom this year due to the pandemic. But 2 years ago, we did have them, in a room, in a city building, open to the public. So that can be a really helpful thing for you to go and check out because it will, it'll allow you to see a panel process kind of happening and you'll see what the discussions are like. So tune into that or contact us if you want more information about that. Okay, so I see another question and I also am not sure I understand it, but I'm going to ask it just in case you all do. It says, for large projects, is it necessary for the board to see an accountant allocating for the funds?
Could you read that one more time, Jen? Sorry.
For large projects, is it necessary for the board to see an accountant allocating for the funds? And if we don't understand that question, we can ask the person who's posed that question to just reword it again. Sorry, that and maybe add a little bit more context around what this question is for you specifically. Okay.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful for me. I feel like I might be misinterpreting the question if I try to read.
Okay. So I'm going to ask another question about cultural equity. So for an organization that maybe hasn't started the cultural equity process yet, like they've not done any strategic planning around that, and their, let's say their art form or their past programming doesn't specifically fit our cultural equity criteria. But they're aware that this is important work and they know that they need to start somewhere. How do they apply for one of our grants? And what's the approach in terms of submitting that application or starting the work or any of the above?
I'll start and then let Weston come in. I think for me, it's really interesting to me, an organization that may be doing something that doesn't specifically address cultural equity, for them to wrestle with the question, so what does cultural equity look like in this particular discipline or field? What does it mean to do this particular thing in a cultural equity way within a community, within a diverse community like Berkeley, and I think if there aren't enough resources within the organization, having an outside person come in to help facilitate the conversation, to form the questions, to start to build the strategies, is it may not be something an organization can afford, but I think in some way bringing in an outside perspective to help begin to define the questions is really helpful. And I think for me, having that process written out, seeing an organization that's really that's looking deeper than just, oh, we're going to bring in a certain number of underrepresented people to be our cultural equity strategy into the programming. For me, that's really interesting, to be wrestling with how does this maybe very European based tradition, how can that embody cultural equity, or how can that advance cultural equity? And if that is a part of the thought process, if that's transparent, then for me, it shows that's the beginning of a vision.
Yeah, that's something you just said, Chris, I think really sparked a sense of like, in some ways, I almost feel like that's where there could be really exciting work. Like if you're in a very classical tradition, say, and that hasn't really had to contend with these things, but you're starting a process where you're trying to think about what does that tradition mean in this in the context of cultural equity, how you're looking at the history of that form, the audiences and patronage systems around that form, and really trying to push into that and find new ways of breaking down barriers to access, trying to create critical context and dialogues around the work. I think that's actually tremendously transformative. So there's a lot of potential there. And so I don't think that you necessarily have to sit there and feel like, oh, well, this isn't for me. I won't engage with it. Um, but I think whether it means bringing in an outside consultant or facilitator, whether it means trying to access a lot of the free resources that are out there, reading lists, webinars, dialogues, classes. I think there's definitely ways that you can sort of do some research, dig around, find that information, and then, like Chris said, do that reflection on what does that mean in your form? What is the history? What are the audiences that have have reached it in the past and haven't been able to reach it? How do you if that's why that's been the case and think through that and not just reach out to people but figure out how you're reshaping and looking at the context for the work, even if the work itself is still the work. Like how are you creating a broader dialogue around it that opens it up for a range of people.
And can you all extend these thoughts to, say, an individual artist? Kind of a similar scenario where maybe they haven't done any work to push their practice towards cultural equity, and maybe they currently feel like it wouldn't score high based on the cultural equity criteria that we have, and they're interested.
This is like just my perspective on it, so it may not be fully addressing it, but I think oftentimes individual artists in some ways have a little bit more leeway because it's so project specific. And I think that, you know, in some ways, how you demonstrate it as an individual artist who's proposing a specific project can be also like it doesn't necessarily have to be as comprehensive. Like you're not trying to necessarily address all aspects of cultural equity. Maybe it's about demonstrating it through the depth of the community relationships you have in that project. And you're working with a specific community, you're you're really deeply engaging the community that you're working with in this really thoughtful process. And that's bringing them into an experience and access to art that they might not have before. And so I think the range of options that you have as an individual artist are actually a little broader because you um, like, yeah, like it's not necessarily about necessarily transforming the whole of everything as much as like yeah uh, sort of carrying it through as deep as possible.
Yeah, and I would just add that you know the process of creating a work is really important, and that cultural equity work could be part of the process of the creation of the work without being a specific component of, if that makes sense, or have measured outcomes in the final product. Um, I just, for example, what does sort of looking at at issues of gender or race, really diving deep into them as part of the process of doing your work, does that shift what you're doing? Does that offer anything to the process of what you're doing? Does being in dialogue with different communities contribute to the process in any way? And I I think I mean, to me, that would be a really interesting thing to read about, and sort of gets to the idea for me that's really interesting about people kind of opening themselves up to be transformed or changed or shifted by doing cultural equity work or research or thinking. I would just add one thing, because I think we might think of cultural equity in terms of it as sort of balancing or with a focus on sort of underrepresented groups. But cultural equity transforms all of us, whether we're privileged or not privileged. And I think kind of recognizing that this is not something done to or for other people, but is actually done for you as well, is maybe a way of it not feeling like it's some add-on thing that you have to do, but it is literally just part of your creative process.
Yeah, thank you, Chris, for saying that. And I do remember in panel reviews in years past, you saying that about how, being interested in knowing how the organization's mission is impacted by, if they're reaching into a specific community and maybe they're not from that community. It's kind of like that reciprocal effect. Like, yes, you're teaching this art form in this community, and then what is this community in turn teaching your organization, and how is your organization kind of changing through that relationship? And I think you were interested to hear more of that in the narratives. So I see Crystal's back, so I'm going to turn it back over to her to close us out.
Hi, everyone. My battery is broken on my laptop, so I lost power. Anyways, hopefully you guys answered all the questions. I'm not sure where we're at, but I think this is the closing marks. I want to say thank you very much to both Chris and Weston for joining us today, providing us with a great deal of knowledge. I know that everyone finds it very helpful. And if anyone else has any more questions about the process, please don't hesitate to contact our office at Civic Arts at cityofberkeley.info, and we'll help assist you. And if there's anything else you guys would like to say, you can say it now. But I just want to say thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris and Weston, and thank you, Crystal, for facilitating this. It was very, very valuable.
Thanks for the invitation. Yeah.
See you later, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.